Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to DuPont Summit 2023. My name is Stephanie Hera, and I am a program coordinator from the Policy Study Organizations. So today we have the panels who will be presenting the various topics and some case studies. So now I would love to hand over this entire presentation to the respective panelists.
Thank you. The title of our talk today is Sociopolitical Obstacles to Scientific Knowledge Transfer. 4 case studies demonstrate common core issues. This talk is going to be delivered by myself, Dr. Joseph L. Graves, Jr., and by my colleagues, Dr. Maureen Kearney from the National Science Foundation, Dr. Gilda Barabino, President of Olin College of Engineering, and Dr. Shirley Malcolm, who is the director of AAAS Sea Change. Now, let's see if we can get this thing to work. So our talk today is based upon a prospective piece that we jointly published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences in February of 2022. And the title of that paper was Inequality in Science and the Case for a New Agenda. And essentially what we argue is that all of the past efforts to address equity and representation in science were misconceived because they essentially saw the process of essentially bringing new persons into the demography of science. And here I mean racially subordinated people, women, LGBTQ plus individuals, but bringing them in within the framework of a scientific enterprise that had been historically directed in the Western world towards benefiting primarily persons of European descent. And we argue that such an approach was doomed to fail from the start. And instead, we argued for the need for real equity in the scientific enterprise, meaning changing the agenda of what sort of research we were doing and who that research would benefit. And as a result of that, we argued that there would be enriched social benefits, that we would also produce better science, that we would improve the workforce environment, and that we would then also have more effective translation of science into applications that would help make the world a better place. Now, you may be familiar with the classic model of technology transfer from basic research to commercial applications. It's called the Valley of Death. And essentially, what happens is a great deal of resources will be directed towards producing basic research. And however, the issue really becomes not so much the basic research and its capacity, but developing that basic research into applications that work in market-driven economies. And so this Valley of Death then is the gap between the discovery of this new information and then being able to commercialize that information so that it actually gets out in the world and does things. Now, we could also argue that there's another Valley of Death, and that is the Valley of Death regarding knowledge transfer between existing research outcomes and beneficial societal outcomes. Now, I would argue, and I'm not speaking for my colleagues here, that part of the problem here is the other Valley of Death, which is driven by commercial and profit motives, which in many ways stands in the way of allowing beneficial research to end up going to work to provide better social outcomes. But of course, we'll have an opportunity to discuss this later on in this session. Now, we're going to present 4 disciplinary cases that identify core societal issues hindering knowledge transfer. And I'm going to start with the first example in biomedical science. So first, what are the societal stakes? Well, currently, over the 20th century, mortality from biological sources ranges from 2.5 to 1 times greater in African Americans than European Americans from birth to age 70. Now, according to the Journal of the American Medical Association, over the last 2 decades alone, structural racism has resulted in an excess of 1.6 million Black deaths. Let me say this again. Due to structural racism, more persons of African descent in the United States die sooner and live more painful lives than they should. And that this has a real economic cost. So the Journal of the American Medical Association calculated that the cost was $238 billion in 2018 alone. I would argue that that's probably an underestimate, depending upon how the AMA came up with their calculation. But at the end of the day, I think we can all agree that this differential mortality that is simply unnecessary based upon existing medical and biomedical technology costs the nation both in terms of its human infrastructure and also economically with regard to real dollars. Now, one of the problems, of course, in biomedical research is the historical harm and exclusion that has led to mistrust in particularly racially subordinated communities. Now, I'm just going to give you one example that sort of sets off where biomedical research has been. In 1771, Dr. Joseph Lewis, the personal physician to Dartmouth University's president, Eleazar Wheelock, peeled the skin from a deceased enslaved man named Cato. He boiled the body in a kettle to free the flesh from the bone and used his skeleton for anatomical study. Cato's skin was then tanned and used to dress the doctor's instrument case. Now, there are many examples in which African bodies served as the means by which American medical progress was made. But these treatments were not made uniformly available to people depending upon their position within the socially stratified racial hierarchy in the United States. Most of what the biomedical research enterprise has done has differentially benefited persons of European descent in the United States. Now, these practices still exist in terms of the current norms that maintain racism and inequality. And here I am showing data from a paper that was published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences in 2016, which looked at false beliefs concerning biological variation held by medical students and residents at the University of Virginia Medical School. Now, I want to point out, and I'm sure folks in this audience understand, the University of Virginia's medical school is not some podunk, small-time operation out in the middle of nowhere. It is one of the most prestigious medical programs in the country. But yet and still, many of the students in that program believe that Blacks age more slowly than whites. So first-year medical students, that belief was 33.3%, and second-year medical students was 38.9%, went down some in third-year medical students to 20.3%, but amongst residents, it was 50%. Now, I would argue that's probably true because the residents at the University of Virginia didn't go through the University of Virginia's medical curriculum. And there were other examples, including Black nerve endings less sensitive than whites. Now, while this was believed by fewer of the doctors there, it has been shown that these sorts of false beliefs about pain sensitivity amongst persons of African descent and persons of European descent actually leads to bias in pain assessment and treatment recommendations in the clinic. Now, there are many more misconceptions about biological variation that still go unchallenged in the medical curriculum around the United States. And I can tell you from my own experience, which I will discuss a little later. Now, how do current norms maintain racism and inequality? Well, here's one really excellent example, which, again, most people probably do not recognize. Most of the genetic variability in our species is found in Africa. Now, the reason for this is because our species first evolved in Africa, and the migration, ancient migration of our species around the world led to sequential loss of genetic variability via serial founder effect. So if we look at, the distribution of cosmopolitan and unique genetic variants, there are more of those unique genetic variants in sub-Saharan Africa, simply because our populations have existed in that environment for the longest period of time. Now, what's the problem with that with regard to biomedical research? Well, the vast majority of clinical studies are done on persons of European descent, which means you're doing clinical studies which by necessity must miss a large sector of the genetic variability of our species, and therefore are underpowered with regard to the ability to detect idiosyncratic responses to various drugs developed by that research protocol. And you can't help but do that simply because you're really looking at the wrong group of people scientifically. Now, who benefits from such a skewed scientific research enterprise? Well, a report that came out in Publica in 2018 demonstrated that Black patients miss out on many promising cancer drugs. And this results from the fact that the clinical trials themselves are misstructured based upon the principles that I just explained in the previous slide. So if we look at, for the 31 drugs studied here, which populations are most at risk, okay, we have, I'm counting 13 in people socially defined as white, but the number of clinical trials for which that population was favored was 30. Whereas for cancers of which people socially defined as Black are most at risk for, there are 12 such cancers, but there was no clinical study in which persons of African descent or socially defined Black people were the majority of those in the study. Similarly, for those in which there is similar risk between folks defined as white or Black, there are 7 cancers. And again, there was no clinical study in which persons of African descent or Blacks were the largest group. Now, why is this scientifically wrong? It's wrong for the reasons I just pointed out, which is the majority of human genetic variation exists within Africa. And therefore, if you were really looking to see how effectively these compounds are going to work, you would want to look at the populations that provide you with the greatest amount of genetic variability, not the smaller amount of genetic variability. Now, why does this happen? It happens because of a history of the biomedical research enterprise and the clinical treatment of persons in this country being biased towards persons of European descent. So it's really not a question of understanding the science. It's a question of the historical social momentum of biomedical research and clinical practice. Now, these issues are perpetuated by the continued inequity in science. And here is an example of a study that I and my colleagues did called Race in the Reading, a study of problematic uses of race and ethnicity in a prominent pediatrics textbook. Now, this textbook was the textbook of the American Academy of Pediatrics. And yet we found that it was rife with racial misconceptions. So we came up with a mnemonic called SCORISC, which stands for first, surrogating socially defined race for social variables, conflating terminology, C, O, overgeneralizing, R, lacking relevance, I, lacking inclusivity, S, promoting stereotypes, and C, making contradictory claims. Now, I want to point out that after we published this study in the journal Academic Medicine, a few weeks later, the American Academy of Pediatrics came out with a statement condemning racial medicine. Now, they didn't do this before our study was published. They did it after our study was published, which exposed the lack of attention they had paid to these problems in the way physicians are trained with regard to biological variation. So I think this ends my presentation, and now I'm going to pass this on to my colleague, Dr. Maureen Kearney.
Thanks, Joe, and good afternoon, everyone. So yes, I'm going to transition now into some analogous issues in the field of environmental biology. And I think you will probably see some echoed themes here throughout our presentations. So when we talk about environmental biology and the stakes for society, the first thing that comes to most people's minds, of course, is the climate crisis. And, you know, to not beat around the bush, we are exceeding the planetary boundaries within which humanity can continue. And generations to come will live with the consequences of that, of our actions or inactions now. Average global temperatures have seen a steep rise, especially since the 1960s, but before that as well. And the results, of course, are increasingly severe. Storms, fires, floods, dangerous heat waves, biodiversity loss, desertification, climate refugees, etc. It's important to note the inequity in climate histories as well. Rich nations produce, of course, the most greenhouse gas emissions, with the US the top emitter, and poor countries suffer the most. And mitigation strategies such as decarbonization and other plans are very costly, and who should pay those costs is a pressing policy question as well. But we do know that vulnerable communities who have historically contributed the least to climate change are disproportionately affected by climate change. May I have the next slide, please, Joe? And there are numerous international policy goals and ongoing plans for curbing the climate crisis, of course. They've come and gone over time as we continue to blow past the goals set out by climate scientists and policymakers. And as we speak, of course, today, COP28 is occurring, the UN Climate Change Conference. Most of the planet's countries will again meet for multilateral agreements to address climate crises and also to help communities adapt to its effects. So relevant to the Valley of Death mentioned before, there's a very long history of science on climate change and an ongoing history of science policy efforts, but an inability to meaningfully bridge the valley. And there's a recent paper in Science that points out some problems with these top-down policy uptake levels in the environmental arena. More on that later. May I have the next slide, please? Another environmental crisis we face is the biodiversity crisis, which is also an existential and moral crisis on par with the climate crisis. The number of endangered species is exponentially increasing, and this has very serious consequences. The biodiversity crisis is interdependent with the climate crisis, because we know that climate change harms biodiversity, and we know that biodiversity loss harms the climate. So one issue cannot be solved without the other. And Joe sort of hinted at the increasing loss of biodiversity, including both at the species level and the important level of genetic diversity, means that ecosystem function and resilience of ecosystems to environmental change is declining. So in addition to that, it also undermines many recent innovation ideas for our future, such as the bioeconomy. There can be no bioeconomy without healthy biodiversity. International Sustainable Development Goals also, because there can be no sustainable development without a resilient planet. Or effective nature-based solutions to global warming, because no nature-based solutions without nature, et cetera. And then there are further societal issues dependent upon biodiversity that we don't quite discuss as often. And these extend to many areas, including national security, defense, emerging diseases and pandemics, food security, displacement and migration of populations due to impoverished lands, and so on, destabilization as a result. So once again, I just want to point out that biodiversity and the threats to its survival are not uniformly distributed across the planet. Research shows that the countries for which biodiversity knowledge is relatively sparse, we have the least biodiversity knowledge, coincides with where biodiversity research and protection is most urgently needed, but not where we're doing the research. Countries that stand to lose the most biodiversity are currently underrepresented in the peer-reviewed literature and in the policy arena as well. And that underrepresentation reduces our capacity to achieve conservation targets, for example, or temperature targets. May I have the next slide, please? So just like with the climate crisis, we have decades of knowledge about the drivers of biodiversity loss, and we also have many policy targets for ameliorating it, but we're not on track to meet them. So many assessments, many international agreements, but ultimately effective policy uptake depends on many factors, as we all know, politics, economics, and other factors to be sure, but public demand for policy and public engagement in science are also important factors in making those policies real. And our argument really is that the public would engage more with science and trust more science if they had more trust in science, and this would affect policy. However, that is undermined to a degree for the issues that Joe has already discussed for biomedical science, because environmental biology also has a history of harm and exclusion, and it's not just historical, it is current. May I have the next slide, please? Just one historical example, we can examine the history of collecting and researching our planet's biodiversity. As you know, scientists and naturalists have collected biodiversity for centuries around the planet. And it's widely acknowledged that that was grounded in a history of colonialist and extractive research practices, which has left a very strong cultural signature on my discipline. So many biological collections are housed in natural history museums, which themselves have roots in sort of the Great Acceleration post-Enlightenment, when they started to become built and cities started to develop and so on. So this is like a global storehouse of planetary biodiversity. It's a very rich data infrastructure that we have, and a lot of important research can be done on it. Historical trends, current trends in changes in biodiversity, along with the metadata that documents the environmental change. So it basically is an infrastructure recording the past and present status of biodiversity, and it allows us to model and make predictions about changes. So the collections themselves are of enormous value to both science and society, but the research norms surrounding their attainment and use are problematic. And so there's a long tradition of engaging in collecting trips and expeditions to areas of the planet that are very rich in biodiversity, and then storing those collected specimens, whether they're physical specimens, genetic tissues, that sort of thing, in institutions throughout the global north, very famous institutions. And then publishing biodiversity discovery and assessment with little or no involvement or attribution of local collaborators and or nations. And this has been normalized for so long, this approach to biodiversity research, that few question the practices until relatively recently. So it's sort of an iconic example, biodiversity science of colonialist science and the harms and the mistrust that it produces. As you can see in these maps, the majority of our planetary biodiversity occurs most densely in certain areas. It's concentrated, and much of it is stewarded by indigenous peoples. But there's a long history before Darwin and up until today that excludes those communities. So it's a history of parachute science or helicopter science instead. Essentially, parachute in, collect and study native biodiversity, deposit samples in museums and other institutions in the global north, and produce research publications by global north scientists. So one way to think about this really is that scientists from the global north hold a monopoly over these collections and data, and that influences knowledge production, because those scientists influence the research agenda, the knowledge production, the application in theory in the field. There is pressure to change and some progress today. For example, the Nagoya Protocol, beginning as a concept of the Convention on Biological Diversity, is a treaty providing a legal framework for the proper utilization of genetic resources, including collected specimens, intellectual outcomes, etc. Another recent example comes from a 2019 global assessment of the Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, which has now called attention to the critical role of indigenous communities in biodiversity science, and also affirms support for a diversity of knowledge systems in the field. So there are more and more calls for decolonizing environmental science and also democratizing its data. As with Joe's points, these issues are not just past relics, they are still in practice today. So that's part of the problem. May I have the next slide, please? And here's just one concrete example that's recent. Endangered coral reef habitat areas, which are very, very important for ameliorating climate change, versus the areas from which publications on those habitats occur. And this concrete example could be extrapolated to research on many different types of organisms and places because it is the norm. And so now, just to shift a little bit from these issues of basic research in my field to applied environmental biology, also having equity issues. May I have the next slide, please? Environmental injustice, of course, is a result of the same patterns of racism and inequality that have existed from the beginning and that affect all sectors, education, housing, healthcare, et cetera, but also the environment. Everyone has the right to the same environmental benefits and protections and meaningful policies. But the reality is that environmental laws and compliance are more likely to be enforced in wealthier communities. And the most marginalized communities are the areas where natural resources are most exploited, pollution most heavily impacts water and air, and toxic waste can be stored. May I have the next slide, please? On a more global level, environmental conservation and mitigation is just not happening in the areas of the world where it's most needed, like many areas of the global south. Shown here are maps of the World Risk Index on levels of environmental vulnerability. And I just also want to mention the environmental conservation movement itself here, just a little bit, aside from science. Dorcetta Taylor, a professor of environmental justice at Yale University School of the Environment, has written a comprehensive social history of the environmental movement and examines how conservation initiatives and politics are tied to social dynamics, such as racism, gender discrimination, et cetera. She shows how race, class, and gender basically influenced every aspect of the conservation movement, including the establishment of reserves, parks, campaigns to protect biodiversity, forest conservation, et cetera. May I have the next slide, please? Just finally, all of these core issues remain contemporary issues. They are not just historical legacies. So hearkening back to the conclusions in our PNAS paper, none of these problems are likely to change dramatically until the demographics of the discipline change, because that will change the culture in the field, the research agendas of in the field, and the knowledge transfer mechanisms in the field. But unfortunately, environmental biology remains a largely white enterprise today. Only 3% of environmental science degrees in the United States are obtained by Black or African American students. So how to make this discipline a discipline where all belong and all are valued for major contributions to these critical existential issues of our time? And I'm going to avoid that answer. I was going to talk about it until we get to the end, and we're going to move on. So now I'd like to hand this over to my colleague Gilda for a look into engineering.
Thank you so much, Maureen, and thank you, Joe. I want to point out that the foundation that's been laid by Joe in biomedical science and marine and environmental biology is very much relevant to any examples that could come from engineering. Engineering as an applied discipline and problem-solving discipline actually would be relevant to all of these factors that we've already discussed. But I want to take a moment to say a couple things that are peculiar to engineering to give a better sense of engineering in particular. The field of engineering has its own legacy of historical harms that have led to mistrust. And we could look at examples from environmental disasters, such as the 3 Mile Island, to structural failures, such as an overpass that collapsed near FIU's campus, the Florida International University in Miami, to other engineering failures. And these failures have really impacted our ability to trust engineering solutions and a concern for the future. And I want to draw attention to 2 particular disasters that were not just related to the catastrophic natural disaster, but a systemic racist set of policies and procedures that actually aggravated the situation. So think about this, for the failure of the levees in the New Orleans that occurred during Hurricane Katrina, there were so many systemic failures, some of which were related to local, state, and environmental, and federal problems in the use of how they managed the disaster. But there were also cases of just diverting funds, where funds for the levees over years had been diverted from the levees to other activities, including like funding a war in Iraq. there was a lack of an evacuation plan. So some of the devastation that was experienced, particularly around some of the decisions that were made, or even mistakes that were made in judging the height of the levees, has really contributed a lot to what actually happened around the devastation. So that's one example. Another example, on the next slide, please, Joe, would be what happened around the water quality crisis in Flint, Michigan. And it came to everyone's attention around 2014. Much of what happened in that crisis were not just engineering failures around treatment and testing of the water, but environmental engineers typically do, but there were a series of major water quality and health issues for the Flint residents. There were a number of issues that had been chronically ignored, overlooked, and discounted by government officials, even as complaints were mounting from the individuals living in Flint about foul-smelling, discolored, and off-tasting water that was piped into Flint homes for 18 months, causing skin rashes, hair loss, and itchy skin. The Michigan Civil Rights Commission, a state-established body, concluded that the poor governmental response to the Flint crisis was a result of systemic racism. So those are just two examples related to not just the crisis itself, but a systemic system of policies, practices, procedures, human decisions that actually caused a problem. I'd like to talk a little bit more about how things are sustained with other examples and how things are normalized. And in the next slide, to give you an example of a particular norm that sustains racism and bias in devices, particularly those that are employing inaccurate or unrepresented data and algorithms. I think many people really know and understand a good bit about the pulse oximeter. It does not always provide accurate readings on darker skin. And what is the result? Misdiagnosis, undetected disease, and medication that's either not prescribed or inadequately prescribed. And again, this is a cause of design that includes racial biases or based on algorithms and data that are not representative. And in the next slide, just give you another example, the ubiquitous soap dispensers, which particularly came into more play post-COVID. It's a common form of engineering technology, but it does not always work for people with darker skin. Next slide. I'd like to say a little bit about unequal access to technologies and use sickle cell disease as an example, a disease that I have studied career long. Sickle cell disease is a genetic disorder, complex disorder that has debilitating consequences for individuals living with the disease, and is caused by a gene defect for the hemoglobin, resulting in sickle cells that are less deformable and not able to pass through the circulation, causes great pain and intensive, what we call vaso-occlusive crises. But now there is a new gene therapy that could actually be curative. And many have probably heard through the news releases that have come out. The UK is actually the first country to have an approved therapy. The companies, Vertex, working along with CRISPR Therapeutics, have come up with a therapy that has actually been approved and is partly in use, but only from clinical applications thus far. So consider that as of 2021, almost 8 million people around the world are living with sickle cell disease. Most of the treatments thus far have been treating symptoms, but not necessarily curative. But now that there is this cure, it could be $1 to $2 million per treatment for gene therapy. And just imagine that those who are in most need are maybe the least likely to receive the treatment because of the costs. That's just one example of having technologies and what engineering feats have been able to do but the lack of accessibility for those in most need is certainly problematic, some of which is coming from our healthcare systems and how we pay for healthcare. And next slide, please, Jim. I'd like to speak a little bit about why these inequities persist and are perpetuated, why we continue to have the harms. Some of it has to do with who becomes engineers, who are the ones who are actually setting the stage for deciding what the problems are to be studied and how those solutions will be approached. So who gets to be an engineer? This chart shows the demographic breakdown of STEM degrees awarded in 2020. You might notice that all STEM degrees awarded in 2020, 17% of all of those, 17% went to Hispanic or Latinx, 9% to Black or African American, less than 1% to Native American or Native Alaskan. We do need more diversity in a field like engineering, and consider that in 2015, less than 5% of engineers in the United States were Black. And in the next slide, to delve into the data a bit more, this chart breaks down STEM degrees earned by Black and African American students. And the point is, there's essentially been no progress in the percentage of undergraduate engineering degrees earned by Black and African American students in the last decade. 4.6% of STEM degrees earned in 2020 by this population were in engineering, but up only from 4.5% in 2011. And I would take note that many of the reasons related to policies, practices, and just the conditions under which we have systemic racism and systemic inequities is some of the gatekeeping that occurs that doesn't often get talked about. And some of this gatekeeping takes the form of weed out courses. Some of it takes the form of elitism and academic elitism in terms of what schools someone comes from, what neighborhood. It's been shown by a number of economists that the zip code that one lives in largely determines both academic opportunities as well as work opportunities. And there's the myth of meritocracy. So this is just one sense of some of the historic problems within engineering in terms of perpetuating what happens, but also the idea that one way to address is to have those who are not represented. And sharing a bit of these statistics was one way to help prove that point. And now I'd like to hand it off to my colleague, Shirley Malcolm, who could speak more about the diversity in STEM fields in the workforce.
Thank you, Gilda. I appreciate all of the problems that all of you have left for me to solve. The representation issues that Maureen has raised, the ballot death issues that Joe has raised, and now who are the engineers that you have raised. But in fact, I think that we need to put this in the context of the larger issue of the fact that government supports research, and the fact that a lot of this notion about why and why it is important harkens from the days of Vannevar Bush and the Science the Endless Frontier. After World War II, Bush made the case that science and government support for science was really an important thing to do. He also made the case for situating this work, this research, in colleges and universities. And the reason that he said this is that, in essence, what you're doing is you're not only getting the research, but you're also preparing the next generation of researchers, and this was an important issue. So if you read in Science the Endless Frontier, you will see Bush quoting a statement from Conant, who was the chair of one of his committees that was looking at education. And he said, in every section of the entire area where the word science may properly be applied, the limiting factor is a human one. We shall have rapid or slow advance in this direction or that, depending on the number of really first-class men who are engaged in the work in question. So at the last analysis, the future of science in this country will be determined by our basic educational policy. Now, I found it very interesting to look at what Bush was proposing. He was proposing providing scholarships because he knew that the talent was out there and that there was some kind of way could in fact support education of the next generation. And one of the things that they were proposing was that you look toward returning veterans. The GI Bill was passed. There was an opportunity for people to get education, but they did not really see the disadvantages that in fact accrued by the strategies that they proposed. First of all, the veterans were overwhelmingly male. So you were already reducing the size of the population or the pool of talent that you could draw from. And even though Blacks were as likely, were qualified for the GI Bill, they came in many cases with deficiencies in K-12 education that would make them make it very difficult for them to be able to go into higher education. And in addition to that, they had very few choices of where they could go in higher education. The Jim Crow South was a situation was where many of them were situated, had laws that forbade their being able to be admitted. The HBCUs, the historical Black colleges and universities, of which there were some, were not necessarily geared up to support their studies within STEM, just because there had been disproportionate resources that had gone to those institutions. And in places outside of the segregated South, they were places were still segregated by tradition. So if we began to think about what we inherited in terms of the pathways and the institutions, we started off behind, way behind, and it was going to be hard to ever catch up. And yet we look today at this larger question: who will do science? Supply and demand in the STEM workforce. Markets work imperfectly. All of a sudden saying, come on, everybody, that's not necessarily going to get it. And yet we look at the supply issues now that are really going to tax, I think, the market. We've seen changing demographics. Right now, we can basically say that Black and brown young people are going to be the majority very shortly, and they already are in some states, for example, in California. Changing gender patterns in higher education. Women weren't necessarily in colleges and universities at the same levels at the time that Bush wrote his particular piece, and he wasn't even necessarily thinking about women as a source of talent based on the comment that he actually made. And yet women are 57% of those in higher education. So if you don't really pay attention to who's there in the pool, you got a problem from the beginning. At the same time that we have relied on using the talent from international sources, we are seeing policies that are restricting those same sources, either on their end, where they are building their own capacity, or on our end of where we are closing the doors. So this is really a very complex issue around the whole question of supply. At the same time, the issue of demand. We have increasing demand for individuals with STEM skills. Within and beyond STEM, things that would be thought of as STEM industries. For example, finance and business. Who are hiring larger numbers of individuals with those STEM skills. And we're looking at things like AI and data science, which are are looking for people with these skills essentially in just about everything. And so we have the demand and we have the supply supply questions, and we have our own valley of death in between. But in addition to numbers and the representational concerns, there are the perspectives issues, the loss of talent. You're really narrowing the people, the pool from which you are drawing, the loss of voice. And we have already heard Dr. Barabino show how a lack of inclusive technology can be deadly. And so we are looking at these issues, but also a loss of innovation and not having the access to science being able to meet the needs of diverse communities. We've had the discussion of the harms and exclusions. Dr. Graves gave you a whole bunch of issues that relate to the health disparities. He could have continued for the rest of the day. We mentioned things like the maternal mortality of Black women, for example, and the disproportionate loss that you experience from there. He could have gone on and talked about the history of J. Marion Sims, the father, quote unquote, of gynecology, and the abuses that he actually visited on enslaved women as he perfected his techniques so that he could use them on people of European origins. Dr. Kearney talked about the climate vulnerabilities and the environmental justice concerns. And she could have kept going and talked about the siting of polluting industries and or the lack of access to potable water. She could have just kept going. And Dr. Barabino could have kept going too. And she mentioned some things, but she didn't mention facial recognition technology, which has had an impact in policing. She didn't mention the early use of airbags that would essentially were deadly to people who were smaller, and especially affected women, or the lack of testing, test crash dummies, for example, of pregnant women and she could have gone on, and the problem is that you could have gone on in all of these areas and many more. Previously, enslaved populations were offered very little education after emancipation. And even as late as the 40s and 50s and 60s, we've had different curricula offered to girls and boys. We have different access to rigorous coursework. Today, we have differential access to rigorous coursework in our high schools. If you look at which schools have AP courses or international baccalaureate programs, they are not those that are serving Black and brown students. And so this is going on. So higher education. Historically, women's colleges offered science study and made outsized contributions to the women who entered STEM. Even today, the historical Black colleges and universities make outside contributions to those in terms of bachelor's degrees, in terms of those who go on and get doctorates. Much of the elite STEM education historically were situated in male-only institutions. So we have this kind of perpetuation of a problem. We had, for example, a significant number, a not insignificant number of Black medical schools that were closed down after the Flexner report because of the kind of recommendations that were being made there that was going to be impossible for those institutions to ever beat just because of the lack of resources that they were not receiving that would allow them to be able to continue. And no access to research institutions and research universities in the Jim Crow South, and limited access elsewhere, little graduate education that was available. And so it's like it is a system. And I think that this is one of the things that we have been trying to say in almost everything that we have ever written together. And that is, you've got to look at this as a total ecosystem and see how the pieces actually work in such a way that they are exclusionary. So the current norms, who defines the research agenda that does or does not include us or meet our needs? Who's serving in policy positions where those decisions are being made? Who is controlling capital so that the businesses that are established are coming forward with innovations that serve the population needs? Who defines and interprets the norms within science? Who decides which science is important? We see the data, the research from the National Institutes of Health, for example, that talk about lower funding rates for scientists of color. Who are the peers who are reviewing their work and saying that this is more important than that? And by what criteria are they being reviewed? Where are the faculty of color? Throughout my entire graduate experience in predominantly white institutions, I never had a faculty member who looked like me. Unfortunately, students can still have that experience. And I think that these are the kinds of things that we don't talk about. Where women faculty, for example, are absent in many fields, even now. And looking at things like computer science or physics, where their absence really has an impact on the field and on the work that the field is actually doing. But there are also the cultural issues that relate to science and engineering, the hyper competitiveness, the opportunity hoarding that we see among many of the elite, quote unquote, faculty, the not sharing credit, the when Maureen was talking about the uh, looking at the biodiversity and many people going in helicopter in to these places where they have the largest biodiversity. And the people who might have worked with them or assisted them receive an acknowledgement, but not co-authorship. There are these kinds of things that you just cannot continue to overlook. And while we have these discussions about, for example, open access and having opportunity to read, very much less is said about the opportunity to publish. And so these are just some of the things where the current norms present problems. In terms of the progress and the unequal benefits, Dr. Barabino mentioned sickle cell. You know, we've known about sickle cell. We've known the molecular problems, and sickle cell is a molecular disease since 1949, when Linus Pauling actually identified this as a sickle cell anemia as the first molecular disease. But between then and now, very little has been devoted to the actual clinical work that it would take in order to be able to address the challenges and the pains and the problems that actually accompany the disease. We have now protection of human subjects regulations only because of Tuskegee and the syphilis experience. Those are the kinds of things where we know we have built up all of these challenges over time. And yet, even today, there is perpetuation of the issues. The erosion of opportunity by legislation or by fiat, such as these anti-DEI rulings that are peppering our states, and the judicial rulings, for example, from the latest ruling from the Supreme Court that talked about who gets admitted. We find ourselves in too many cases the objects of study rather than the participants in the research, such as with looking at the human issue of human genomic diversity. And I do want to stop because I think that we need to go back and revisit some of the things that we in fact talked about earlier, where we talk, one of the issues that I will throw onto the table is this notion of reinterpreting the Valley of Death. Would a more inclusive process remove that artifact? And I call it an artifact because the definition of artifact actually applies in this case. Something observed in a scientific investigation or experiment that is not naturally present but occurs as a result of the preparative or investigative procedure. Is the exclusionary way that we do science the thing that actually produces this valley, because there is not the flow of interest between those who might do the discoveries and those who seriously need the things that result from those discoveries? Thank you.
Okay, so is there any question? So if nobody have any questions, then I would like to extend my heartfelt thanks for the enlightening presentation on the sociopolitical obstacles to scientific knowledge transfer. Full case study demonstrating the common core issues, like your in-depth analysis of challenges in knowledge transfers within the sociopolitical context was both insightful and thought-provoking. And once again, thank you so much for sharing your expertise and shedding light on these crucial challenges. And your presentations, has left a lasting impact, and I'm grateful for the opportunity to learn more from your insight. So thank you so much, sir. Thank you so much, ma'am, and thank you so much for coming and attending. Sure. So now we will be ending this presentations right here.
Well, thank you all.
Thank you so much, sir.